Patricia's voice cut like broken glass through the evening air. "That chair goes, or you both go with it. Final warning." She leveled a pistol at my mother's temple, lips curled into a smile that told me she believed every ounce of power in this neighborhood belonged to her. My mother's knuckles whitened against the carved wooden arms, her rocking stilled mid-motion as if she could freeze the danger out of existence. "You really want to do this?" I asked, stepping onto the porch with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes when every nerve is on fire. Her laugh was short, sharp. "This isn't your jurisdiction, Sheriff. This is HOA property, and I enforce it." I tilted my head, just enough so the evening light caught the star pinned above my heart. "That gun's already logged in the county system. You didn't file the serial update, did you?" For the first time, her grip faltered. That was the stop scroll moment, the point where smug certainty cracked into something else. I saw it, and I let her see that I saw it. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. "Daniel Mercer," I said evenly, "sheriff of this county, son of the man who built this house before Willow Creek Estates even existed. You can threaten neighbors with fines all you like, Patricia, but pointing a weapon at my mother? That's not HOA business. That's a felony." Her jaw twitched, but she didn't lower the pistol. The chair beneath my mother was more than wood and varnish. My father carved it the year before. Cancer claimed him, working long into nights when his hands already shook from the treatment. He told my mother she'd never need to visit his grave to feel him close. Just sit here, and he'd always be beside her. She'd rocked on that porch every morning since, whispering his name into dawn light. That was what Patricia tried to erase with her citations and fines. Not a piece of furniture, but the last tether between my mother and the man she'd lost. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. I could still hear the cicadas droning in the hedges, their shrill rhythm pressing against the standoff like a second heartbeat. My boots creaked against the porch boards as I shifted, steady, deliberate, blocking my mother from the pistol's line. Patricia's eyes flicked, calculating, but she underestimated one thing. When I wore the badge, every violent twitch, every reckless word became evidence. "This chair isn't just furniture," I said softly, but with steel under the words. "It's the reason my mother wakes up each morning. You think you can strip that away because it doesn't match your color palette? Not here, not tonight." The smell of gun oil hung sharp between us, carried on the evening breeze. My mother's breath rattled behind me, quick, shallow. I kept my body square to Patricia, giving her no opening, no reason to flinch into something irreversible. I knew two things in that moment. First, Patricia had finally crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. Second, she had no idea that by pointing her weapon, she'd just shifted the battlefield out of HOA bylaws and straight into state law, insurance liability, and criminal jurisdiction. The ground she thought was hers was already crumbling beneath her feet. "Where are you watching from?" Patricia thought she was policing rocking chairs. She didn't realize she had just declared war against a sheriff who'd buried a father, protected a mother, and swore an oath that didn't end at a property line. She chose the wrong porch, the wrong family, and the wrong man to try to break. Patricia's eyes narrowed, but the weapon dipped just enough for me to ease my mother back into the doorway. I held her gaze the entire time, memorizing the twitch of her lip, the stubborn shake of her head. She thought she had won by leaving with her threats intact. What she didn't know was that I'd already shifted the battleground. By the next evening, word had spread faster than the dust shadows over Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors gathered in the small community park, kids' bikes leaning against benches, murmurs rising like a swarm of restless bees. People whispered about what Patricia had done, some in disbelief, others in hushed tones of fear. "She pointed a gun," one woman muttered, clutching her husband's arm. I knew she was strict, but her voice trailed off, unfinished but heavy with dread. I walked through them quietly, nodding at faces that turned quickly away. Some offered brief glances of solidarity, but most carried the weight of silence. They had lived under Patricia's rules long enough to know what happened to those who spoke too loudly. Fines appeared, liens followed, letters stacked like bricks meant to wall families out of their own homes. I stopped by the gazebo at the park center, where the HOA's bulletin board stood like a monument to control. The latest violation notices were posted in neat rows: overgrown hedges, driveway cracks, garden flags. Small infractions, all punished with threats of escalation. The paper edges curled in the humidity, but the ink was bold, unyielding. Patricia made sure her reach was always visible, and behind me, whispers carried a heavier truth. A neighbor recalled the time Patricia fined him for leaving his trash bins out for half an hour too long. Another spoke of her threats to revoke community pool access because a child's swimsuit wasn't the approved shade of navy. These weren't isolated complaints. They were part of a pattern, one I could use. I leaned closer to the notices, scanning dates and signatures. The same flourish marked each one, Patricia's handwriting. She wasn't delegating authority. She was centralizing it, drawing all power into her hands. That meant the board either feared her or they didn't know the extent of her actions. Either way, it created pressure points. The cicadas were replaced tonight by the rhythmic chirp of crickets, but the unease remained. I could feel it in the way neighbors kept their conversations clipped, glances darting toward the clubhouse windows where Patricia's silhouette occasionally appeared. Even here, in a park meant for relaxation, people moved like guests in her house. My father would have hated this. He believed neighborhoods should breathe, not choke under rules written in arrogance. That's why he carved the chair in the first place. So, my mother could rest in peace without needing anyone's permission. One man lingered near me, arms crossed, eyes flicking to the bulletin board. "You're making waves, Mercer," he muttered. His voice was low, strained. "Careful how far you push. She doesn't forget." It wasn't a warning. It was a confession of fear, and fear meant leverage. I took in the faces around me, retirees clutching HOA letters, young parents whispering apologies for their kids' laughter, homeowners dragging their feet to avoid notice. Patricia had turned Willow Creek into her stage, and everyone else into reluctant actors. But there's one thing bullies never understand. Every crowd that watches in silence is also collecting resentment. It only takes one spark to turn whispers into a chorus. I stepped back from the board, letting the neighbors see me study the signatures, the dates, the pattern. I didn't need to say it aloud. They saw the badge on my chest, the calm on my face. They knew I wasn't just another neighbor fed up with grass height complaints. "Where are you watching from?" Patricia believed she was untouchable because she wrote the violations herself. But that was also her weakness. Every pattern leaves a trail, and every trail ends at accountability. Tonight, in the quiet of the park under the gaze of fearful neighbors, I knew exactly how I'd start pulling the thread. The crowd in the park had begun to thin, neighbors drifting away in pairs and small groups, carrying their fear home with them like contraband. I stayed rooted near the bulletin board until the last of the murmurs dissolved into night. That's when I caught sight of Mark Devereaux. He lingered on the far edge of the park, close to the clubhouse lights, his posture stiff as if the ground itself might give way. His arms were crossed too tightly across his chest, fingers digging into his sleeves until the fabric strained. He wasn't watching the neighbors leave, he was watching me. I took a slow step in his direction. His eyes darted away, toward the clubhouse windows where Patricia's blinds snapped shut. He shifted on his feet, one shoe grinding into the gravel path, as if trying to bury words he didn't dare speak. "Evening, Mark," I said. His head bobbed in the barest nod, but his lips pressed, flat, sealed tight. His jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he uncrossed his arms and rubbed his palms together, a nervous tick that betrayed more than any sentence could. "Rough meeting?" I asked, tilting my head toward the clubhouse. He exhaled through his nose, shoulders sagging. His gaze flicked back to me, then to the ground, then up again, like a man fighting himself. The light from the lamppost cut across his face, highlighting the tension etched at his temples. I could read him as clearly as I'd read suspects across interrogation tables. His silence wasn't defiance, it was conflict. Mark wasn't built for Patricia's brand of control, but he'd been too close to her fire to risk pulling away. "You know," I said quietly, "patterns leave trails. And trails lead somewhere. You've seen them." His fingers twitched. He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. He shifted his weight again. shoes scuffing like drumbeats of hesitation. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of the words he was terrified to let slip. "I shouldn't," he finally muttered, voice rasping, barely more than breath. His eyes darted again toward the clubhouse, and his whole body tilted slightly away from me, like a man torn between flight and confession. But the tremor in his hands told the real story. Patricia's reach wasn't just intimidation on paper. It had sunk into the bones of the board itself. "I get it," I said, keeping my tone calm, steady. "You've got to live here. You've got family to think about. But know this." She pointed a gun at my mother. "That isn't HOA business. That's something bigger, and sooner or later, someone else is going to get hurt." Mark's lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, he wiped his palms on his slacks and took a half step back. His body language screamed retreat, but his eyes, those betrayed him. They carried something sharp, unspoken, that flared when I mentioned the gun. He knew more, and it was eating at him. A cicada buzzed in the trees above us, then went silent, as if even nature wanted to hear his choice. "Where are you watching from?" I asked softly, more to the unseen audience than to Mark. But he flinched as though the question had landed squarely on his chest. His throat bobbed. You don't know what she's capable of," he whispered, and then the dam almost broke. His shoulders hunched, his hands flexed open like he was about to spill everything. But then, the clubhouse door slammed in the distance, and Patricia's voice echoed across the park, sharp and commanding, calling for someone inside. Mark froze. His spine straightened, arms locking once again across his chest like armor. He gave me a curt nod, too fast, too stiff, and turned away. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. That brief crack in his armor told me enough. Patricia's control was rotting the board from the inside, and guilt was pulling Mark apart seam by seam. Sooner or later, guilt always demanded release. I stepped back from the lamppost, letting the night close around me. Patricia believed she had silence stitched tight across the community. But silence under pressure doesn't last. It fractures, splinters, and finally breaks. Mark Devereaux was already breaking. Mark's retreat left me standing in the hush of the park, the lamppost humming faintly above me. His silence was louder than any confession. I knew then that Patricia's grip wasn't just fear on paper. It was fear sewn into people's skin. But cracks had formed, and cracks always spread. The next morning, I found the escalation waiting at my doorstep. A stack of violation notices, bound with a rubber band, had been nailed right into the wooden porch rail. The sharp scent of splintered pine filled the air where Patricia's hammer had broken the grain. She wanted me to see it first thing, to feel the weight before my coffee even cooled. I pulled the bundle free. Each sheet was stamped with red ink. Final warning. The rocking chair, lawn height, parking alignment, even the porch light. Apparently not the approved wattage. Every page bore her heavy signature, the flourish of someone drunk on authority. But it wasn't just me she was targeting. At the HOA office later that day, I saw the notices plastered across the bulletin board. Families I'd spoken with at the park now had their names posted in bold, shamed-for cracked driveways or faded shutters. The office, tucked behind manicured hedges, smelled of stale coffee and ink. It was meant to be a hub for community business, but Patricia had turned it into a war room. Inside, her voice carried sharp through the walls. Non-compliance will not be tolerated. I don't care who they are. If they think they can ignore me, they'll learn fast enough. I leaned against the frame of the hallway, letting her words roll into me. She wasn't even trying to hide her escalation anymore. And the board members who sat at the table, they looked like prisoners. Eyes down, fingers drumming nervously, no one dared object. Mark sat among them, shoulders hunched, lips pressed tight. He avoided my gaze through the glass, but the way his leg bounced under the table told me everything. Patricia's warpath was breaking him piece by piece. The smell of toner filled the room as she shoved another stack of notices across the table. "New patrol schedule," she barked. "Security rounds, armed if necessary. Our image is everything security rounds. Armed." Patricia was doubling down, not just against me, but against the entire neighborhood. I let the moment etch into memory, the trembling treasurer, the board's silence, Patricia's voice cutting through like a whip. Evidence wasn't always paperwork. Sometimes it was the weight of a moment, the cadence of intimidation echoing through walls. When the meeting ended, Patricia brushed past me in the hallway. Her perfume was sharp, cloying, designed to linger. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just smirked as if daring me to move. Behind her, Mark slowed, his steps faltering. He opened his mouth, then shut it quickly when she glanced over her shoulder. The elevator doors slid shut between them, and in that fleeting silence, he muttered under his breath, "It's worse than you think." His eyes flicked with panic, and then he was gone down the stairwell before I could press. I exhaled, the stale office air heavy in my lungs. She thought this escalation would corner me, but she didn't realize every new patrol, every armed threat, every public notice was stacking liability like tinder around her feet. "Where are you watching from?" I stepped out into the sunlight, the sharp cut of manicured grass beneath my boots, the office behind me bristling with her commands. Patricia believed escalation was strength. But escalation leaves trails, and trails are what I follow. She had chosen the path herself, and I was already walking it. I left the HOA office with the sun sharp in my eyes and Patricia's words still rattling in my skull. Armed patrols, security rounds. She was setting this neighborhood up for a disaster, and she was too blinded by her own authority to see the cliff she was walking them toward. But I saw it, clear as day, and I knew exactly where to push. Back at the sheriff's office, the evidence table groaned under years of paperwork and confiscated odds and ends. The room smelled faintly of old leather and copier ink, a place where truth was preserved in ink and signatures. I set Patricia's notices down beside the bundle from my porch. Every page had her name, her flourish, her claim of authority. It wasn't the violations that mattered, it was what they represented. When I ran my finger across the thick stack, I could already see the insurance forms in my mind. No coverage in the state would tolerate an HOA president authorizing armed patrols and issuing threats beyond her legal standing. Liability wasn't just a word, it was a wrecking ball aimed squarely at her board. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Randall, an insurance investigator who'd spent his career dismantling fraud cases and policy abuses, picked up after 2 rings. His voice carried the dry patience of a man who had heard every excuse in the book. "Mercer," he said, recognition sparking in his tone. "It's been a while. What are you working on?" "An HOA president running her community like a private militia," I said. There was a pause, then the scrape of a chair on his end. "That's not small talk. Tell me more." I laid it out for him, the gun at my mother's head, the escalation into armed patrols, the personal signatures on every violation notice. The silence on the other end was longer this time, heavier. Then came a low whistle. "You're right. That's a liability nightmare. If they're authorizing armed enforcement without proper contracts or coverage, they've just opened the board, and every homeowner tied to it, to exposure. Insurance carriers won't touch that with a 10-foot pole." Exactly the crack I needed. Patricia thought her power was absolute, but her arrogance had built a trap around her. She wasn't just endangering herself, she was endangering every neighbor she claimed to protect. "Can you get me documentation?" I asked. "Already on it," Randall said. "If what you're saying checks out, their carrier will be forced to reevaluate coverage. If that gun incident hits the file, the premiums alone could bankrupt them. And if there's proof of falsified enforcement, they could lose coverage altogether." The line went quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was calculation. I hung up, my fingers drumming against the desk. Patricia believed she was fighting me with HOA rules. But the battlefield had shifted into her weakest ground, state law and insurance liability. She could bully neighbors with fines and notices, but no HOA survived without coverage. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead sharpened my thoughts. I imagined the look on her face when she realized every armed patrol she bragged about had become evidence against her, every violation notice a nail in the board's financial coffin. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. My mother's rocking chair came into focus, the smooth curve of the wood under her hands, the faint creak of the boards when she rocked. That chair wasn't just memory. It was survival, her anchor to the life she and my father had built. Patricia had tried to rip it away, but now I had the means to make sure it never moved an inch. When I opened my eyes, the evidence table looked different. Not just clutter and paper, but a weapon forged from Patricia's own arrogance. And in my line of work, weapons in the wrong hands always ended up backfiring. The discovery was clear. Patricia's violations weren't just abuses of power. They were proof of negligence, of liability so deep it could pull her entire board under. And the moment that proof landed on Randall's desk, the clock would start ticking. Patricia thought she could scare me with paper and patrols, but she'd just given me the lever to break her. Patricia thought her notices and armed patrol threats would bury me in fear, but they only sharpened my resolve. By the time I left the sheriff's office that evening, I knew exactly where the next battle would be drawn. The paper trail was useful, but it wasn't enough on its own. To make the insurance case stick, I needed the personal stake tied directly to the violation that started it all, the rocking chair. I returned home to find my mother on the porch, the chair rocking gently beneath her. The air carried the smell of jasmine from the neighbor's hedge, but underneath it lingered the faint, acrid tang of splintered wood from where Patricia had nailed those notices earlier. My mother's hands smoothed the carved armrests, as if she could polish away the intrusion. Her eyes lifted to me. "They'll never let this go, will they?" "No," I admitted, stepping closer. "But neither will I." I crouched beside the chair, running my hand along the grain my father had shaped decades ago. I remembered the sound of his tools rasping against wood, the way he hummed quietly when he worked. Every groove was memory, every curve a promise. Patricia had tried to reduce it to an infraction code, but here it was, the heart of everything. The letter she'd sent my mother still sat on the small table beside the chair, its edges curled from the humid air. My mother had folded it carefully, but the words inside carried enough venom to choke her peace. Eviction threats, legal bluster, Patricia's handwriting again, looping and bold, as if daring us to fight back. I picked it up, let the paper crinkle between my fingers, and slipped it into a folder. It wasn't just intimidation. It was evidence of harassment that bled beyond her authority. Randall would want this. So would the district attorney. Inside, the house was quiet except for the tick of the old mantel clock. I spread the folder across the kitchen table, laying the letter beside the violation stack. Together, they told the story Patricia never meant anyone to see. Abuse of power escalating into criminal threat. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was about liability, about a president who thought she could play sheriff without a badge. And the more she reached, the more rope she gave me to tighten around her position. I sat at the table and made the call I'd been circling for days. District Attorney Collins answered on the second ring. His tone was clipped but steady, the voice of a man used to carrying the weight of ugly truths. "Collins," he said. "It's Mercer," I replied. "I've got an HOA president making armed threats and issuing eviction warnings outside her authority. I need this on record." There was a pause, the faint shuffle of papers on his end. "Tell me everything." I did. The chair, the gun, the letters, the armed patrol schedule. By the time I finished, silence held the line like a verdict. "This isn't an HOA dispute anymore," Collins said at last. "This is potential criminal intimidation. And if insurance pulls out, that board is standing on quicksand. Get me copies of everything. I'll review it with Randall's findings." Relief flickered in my chest, not because the fight was over. It was far from that. But because the path forward was no longer mine alone. Patricia had dragged my mother into her crosshairs, and now she dragged the county with her. I closed the folder and slid it across the table. My mother watched from the porch doorway, her silhouette framed by the last gold light of the setting sun. "Your father would be proud," she whispered. I nodded, the weight of her words grounding me. This wasn't just about holding Patricia accountable. It was about protecting the promise my father left behind in the grain of this wood. The chair wasn't moving. Not now, not ever. Patricia had crossed from violations into intimidation, and I had the proof to show it. From here, every step would pull her deeper into the consequences she never thought would touch her. And when the board realized her recklessness threatened their homes too, the ground beneath her would finally collapse. The night settled heavy over Willow Creek Estates, cicadas droning in the trees like restless machinery. I'd just finished filing copies of Patricia's threats when I saw headlights sweep across the curtains. A car idled at the curb too long to be casual. When the engine finally cut, silence filled the street and a lone figure climbed out. Mark Devereaux. He lingered at the edge of the driveway, shoulders bent, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His gaze swept the neighborhood before he took a step forward, then another, like each move weighed him down. By the time he reached the porch, sweat glistened along his temple, though the night air was cool. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if Patricia herself might be hiding in the shadows. His arms crossed tight across his chest, then dropped, then rose again, the cycle of a man trapped between truth and silence. I opened the screen door slowly. "You came anyway." He let out a ragged breath. "Because if I don't tell someone, it's going to eat me alive." His voice cracked, and his hands rubbed together compulsively. He looked smaller somehow, as though guilt had been grinding him down inch by inch. I motioned him inside. The kitchen light painted his face in stark relief, and for the first time, I saw the deep grooves of fear etched there. He sat heavily at the table, elbows braced, head bowed. "She's gone too far," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We all know it, but nobody on that board has the guts to stop her. She threatens liens, lawsuits, even families if we step out of line. But this time, it's more than bullying." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, his fingers trembling as he set it on the table. "Patrol contracts," he explained. "Drafts Patricia had me type up. Only, they're not real contracts. No signatures, no authorization from the board, nothing filed with the insurer. She planned to circulate them to make it look official." I scanned the page. The language was sloppy, littered with threats of enforcement authority she didn't possess. It was a house of cards, waiting for the first breeze to topple it. Mark's eyes were bloodshot when he looked up. "She told me to forge the board secretary's initials if I had to. Said it would shut people up. I couldn't do it, Mercer. I've gone along with a lot, but not this. If those patrols put a gun in the wrong hands, someone's going to get hurt or killed." His hands shook so violently he gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles blanched. I didn't need him to say more. His body told me everything. The weight of complicity, the fear of retribution, the desperation to finally cut free. "You've just given me what I needed," I said quietly. He shook his head, panic flashing. "If she finds out I came here—" "She won't," I cut in. "But this puts the liability squarely in her lap. No board approval, no insurer on record, and she's pressing armed patrols. That's criminal negligence waiting to happen." Mark buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. "I never wanted this job. I thought it was about keeping the place tidy, organizing budgets. I didn't sign up to watch a woman turn a neighborhood into her kingdom." I leaned back, letting his words hang in the air. The kitchen clock ticked between us, a steady rhythm counting down the time Patricia had left before this house of cards collapsed. Mark finally raised his head, eyes hollow but resolved. "I'll testify if it comes to that. Just promise me you'll protect my family. She'll go after them first." I met his gaze and nodded. "You did the right thing tonight, and when this comes down, you won't stand alone." He exhaled shakily, the confession leaving him lighter, though fear still clung to his every movement. When he left, he glanced over his shoulder again and again, as though shadows themselves carried Patricia's wrath. But it didn't matter. The moment he placed that paper in my hands, the balance shifted. Patricia wasn't just a bully anymore. She was a liability documented by her own treasurer, and now, for the first time, the walls of her control had a crack big enough to break wide open. Mark's footsteps had barely faded down the street when I spread the forged draft across my evidence table. The words stared back at me like an open wound, threats dressed as contracts, a dictator's decree masquerading as policy. Patricia had crossed the line from petty tyrant to architect of real danger, and now I had the treasurer's testimony to prove it. The sheriff's department was quiet this late. Phones silent, hallways dim, the only sound the steady hum of the air vents. I closed the blinds to my office and set out the folder, Patricia's letters to my mother, the stack of violation notices, and now Mark's document. Together, they formed the skeleton of her abuse, bone by bone. But It wasn't enough to have the bones. I needed the muscle, the connective tissue that would make this case stand under scrutiny. Patricia was shrewd enough to twist neighbor complaints into disgruntled residents if given the chance. I needed the agencies that mattered, the district attorney and Randall, with the insurance firm, to see not just intimidation, but reckless liability that endangered every homeowner in Willow Creek. I drafted a memorandum outlining the timeline, each step escalating beyond her legal authority. Gun pointed at my mother, armed patrol schedules, forged contracts, intimidation letters. With every line, I tied her actions not to vague misconduct, but to measurable, undeniable exposure. An HOA could survive grumbling neighbors. It couldn't survive criminal intimidation paired with insurance withdrawal. By the time the first traces of dawn glowed faintly through the blinds, I had a package ready. A duplicate for Collins at the DA's office, another for Randall, copies secured in the department's digital archive. Patricia could shred notices, threaten witnesses, even bully the board into silence, but the trail was already preserved beyond her reach. Still, a case on paper wasn't enough. I needed her to incriminate herself further, to create the moment where her arrogance met authority head-on. That was how these stories always ended, not with quiet apologies, but with the crash of consequences when the truth could no longer be contained. I left the office and drove straight to the courthouse, the city still half asleep around me. The marble steps were slick with morning dew, the stone echoing under my boots as I carried the file inside. Collins met me in his office, dark circles under his eyes, but sharp as ever. "You weren't exaggerating," he said, after scanning the drafts and letters. "This isn't HOA business. It's corporate negligence paired with criminal intimidation. We'll move on it, but timing matters. Let her escalate one more time, and we'll have grounds the whole board can't ignore." "Randall?" I asked. "Already looped in," Collins said. "He's drafting a notice of coverage suspension. Once it lands, the board will realize she's put their own homes on the line. That's when the tide will turn." I left the courthouse with the rising sun burning gold across the skyline, its light catching on glass windows and courthouse pillars. Patricia's empire was still standing, but the foundations had already cracked. She just didn't know it yet. Back in Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood looked deceptively calm. Sprinklers arched water over perfect lawns, children rode bikes down freshly paved streets, and neighbors waved stiffly, their smiles fragile. But beneath the surface, fear rippled. I could see it in the way eyes darted toward Patricia's house, in the hesitation before anyone spoke too loudly. I parked at the curb and stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the scent of cut grass and morning air. My gaze drifted to my mother on the porch, her rocking chair creaking gently as she sipped her tea. She looked fragile against the vastness of Patricia's shadow, but she also looked resolute. That chair wasn't going anywhere. I made her a silent promise then and there. By the time this was done, Patricia wouldn't just lose her grip. She'd face the full force of the law she thought she could bend. The plan was set. Evidence collected, agencies aligned, allies ready. Now I needed to wait for Patricia to step too far into the open. And when she did, the trap would close, not with vengeance, but with justice. The waiting never came easy, but in my line of work, timing was everything. Patricia's downfall couldn't be forced. It had to unfold, each step drawing her deeper into the snare she built with her own arrogance. I had evidence, allies, and the law on my side. Now I needed her to give me the final piece. A public act that exposed her to the board she ruled through fear. That opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. A notice was slipped under every door in Willow Creek Estates. Emergency community meeting, attendance required. The bold type, signed by Patricia, left no room for misinterpretation. She wanted a stage, and she wanted the audience to remember who controlled their lives. I walked the streets that afternoon and watched neighbors reading the notice with tight jaws and pale faces. Some cursed under their breath. Others folded it quickly, as if hiding it could make it vanish. The HOA clubhouse, with its polished oak doors and glossy tile floors, was being prepared like a courtroom. I knew then the confrontation wasn't days away. It was hours. Before I headed there, I made one more stop. Randall's downtown office. The building smelled of paper and ink, the air humming with printers and muted conversations. He met me in the lobby, file in hand, his tie loosened as if he'd been living in paperwork since dawn. "It's official," he said, passing me the file. "Coverage suspension is pending. Once Patricia's actions are confirmed in front of the board, her liability becomes theirs. No insurer will touch this HOA under her leadership. Show this to Collins if you need it." I flipped the folder open. The words inside weren't just text. They were a financial guillotine. Every homeowner tied to this HOA stood to lose the safety net they didn't even realize was at risk. And Patricia had signed the rope, holding the blade aloft. "Timing?" I asked. Randall's eyes sharpened. "She slips again in public, that's when it lands. No wiggle room, no spin." I thanked him and left, the weight of the folder heavy in my grip. Patricia wanted a stage. I was going to give her one, but this time the spotlight would expose every fracture in her power. That evening, the clubhouse buzzed like a hive. Neighbors filed in, voices low, bodies tense. The room smelled of coffee and polished wood, but underneath lingered the unmistakable current of dread. I stood near the back, folder tucked beneath my arm, my badge catching the overhead lights. Patricia entered last, dressed sharply, her hair pinned into a severe knot. She moved with the confidence of a queen surveying her subjects. Behind her, board members trailed like shadows. Mark was among them, his gaze avoiding mine, his shoulders hunched as if the very act of walking beside her was a confession. She wrapped her hand against the podium, the sound snapping the room into silence. "We're at a crossroads," she began, her voice slicing clean through the air. "This community is under threat from disobedience and disrespect. I will not allow disorder to poison what we've built here. That's why security patrols are not only continuing, they will expand." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Parents exchanged panicked glances. Retirees shook their heads. Patricia's smirk widened, feeding off their fear. She continued, each word sealing her fate. "Contracts have been authorized. Enforcement will be immediate. Non-compliance will be met with consequences." I glanced at Mark, his hands clenched at his sides, his face pale, but he didn't move, not yet. The time for his testimony was coming, and he knew it. Patricia looked out at the crowd like a general ready to crush rebellion. What she didn't realize was that she'd just confirmed everything Randall and Collins needed: armed patrols, unauthorized contracts, direct threats. Every word carried liability, each sentence another nail in the coffin of her authority. I tightened my grip on the folder, my heart steady. This was the preparation phase, the final lining up of pieces before the hammer fell. Patricia had built her empire on intimidation, but tonight she'd spoken the words that would unravel it. And when the board saw what her arrogance had cost them, they'd have no choice but to watch her empire burn. Patricia's words still echoed in the clubhouse when I stepped outside into the night. The air was cool, but it carried the heat of tension radiating from every neighbor who just heard her threaten them with armed patrols. People lingered in knots near the parking lot, whispering urgently, their faces pale beneath the overhead lights. The meeting had ended without resolution, but Patricia thought she'd sealed her authority. She had no idea she'd just confirmed everything I needed. I walked past the clusters of residents, folder tucked beneath my arm. Their eyes followed me, searching for reassurance, though most didn't dare speak. A few gave small nods, quiet acknowledgments that they understood something had shifted. They just didn't know how much. My next stop wasn't home. It was the courthouse annex, a squat brick building that hummed with fluorescent lights long after most of the city had gone to sleep. District Attorney Collins had agreed to meet me there, and when I entered, I found him waiting with his jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the fatigue of years of late nights etched into his expression. "Tell me you recorded it," he said. I slid the flash drive across his desk. "Every word." She confirmed unauthorized contracts, armed patrols, and consequences for non-compliance. She practically read your opening statement for you. Collins plugged it in, his eyes narrowing as Patricia's voice filled the room. Even without seeing her, the arrogance was unmistakable. His jaw tightened. "That's intimidation on record. And if Randall's notice hits tomorrow, the board will know they're exposed. They'll have to choose between protecting her or protecting their own homes." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle into place. The homeowners have lived under her shadow for too long. Once they realize her actions threaten their property values and insurance, they won't stand with her. Collins leaned back, fingers steepled. Then it's time we make this public. We'll deliver the notice in front of the entire board. Let them see the liability with their own eyes. The plan was set, but execution required more than evidence and legal threats. It required positioning. Patricia had built her power by making everyone believe she was untouchable. To shatter that illusion, the confrontation couldn't be hidden in back offices or sealed documents. It had to unfold where the community could see her fall. By the time I left the annex, the city was asleep, but my thoughts were sharp. Patricia had no idea that her empire was already collapsing. Tomorrow, when the notice arrived and the board realized their homes and bank accounts were on the line, her smirk would finally fade. Morning came, with brittle sunlight over Willow Creek Estates. I walked the neighborhood deliberately, letting people see me, letting them know I hadn't been cowed. Patricia's car was already in her driveway, polished and gleaming. A queen's carriage parked before her crumbling castle. Curtains shifted as I passed, neighbors peering out like witnesses waiting for the first stone to drop. At noon, the board gathered again, this time in the HOA's main hall, a space designed for community celebrations, but long ago repurposed into Patricia's throne room. The smell of Polish clung to the wooden floor, chairs lined in rigid rows. Patricia stood near the podium, papers stacked neatly in front of her, lips curved into that familiar smirk. She believed today was hers. But Collins was already inside, his briefcase set squarely on the table, Randall's documents ready. I entered behind him, folder in hand, and felt the tension ripple through the room. Mark sat stiffly at the end of the board's table, his eyes darting between Patricia and me. His jaw clenched, but this time he didn't look away. Patricia started to speak, her tone commanding as ever, but Collins cut her off. His voice was calm, steady, backed by authority that couldn't be ignored. He laid the notice on the table, its official seal catching the light. Gasps broke through the room as the words became clear. Coverage suspended, pending investigation of unauthorized armed enforcement. The board members shifted uneasily, murmurs rising like a tide. Patricia's smirk faltered, the first crack in her mask. She reached for the papers as if she could, tear them apart and erase the truth, but Collins' hand came down firmly, stopping her cold. This was the moment we'd positioned for. Patricia standing exposed, the board realizing their loyalty to her was costing them their safety, their homes, their future. She could bluster, she could threaten, but she couldn't erase the seal of the state or the weight of liability. The confrontation had begun, and the stage was set for her empire to collapse under the eyes of the very people she thought she controlled. The room fractured the moment Collins placed the suspension notice on the table. Voices erupted, sharp and panicked. The kind of sound you'd expect from a crowd told their homes had just been dragged to the edge of a cliff. Some board members whispered furiously to one another. Others stared blankly at the seal, as if the weight of it hadn't yet sunk in. Patricia tried to rise above the noise, her voice pitched high, commanding. "This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. Our insurance is intact. Our authority is intact. This is nothing but scare tactics from outsiders who don't understand how this community operates." But her words didn't land the way they used to. For the first time, the board didn't move in step with her. Their eyes flicked not to Patricia, but to Collins, to me, to the notice itself. Fear was a sharper motivator than her bluster. I stood at the back, arms folded, my badge glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. I didn't need to speak yet. Patricia was unraveling herself, and everyone could see it. Mark shifted in his seat at the far end of the table. His shoulders rose and fell with uneven breaths, his hands clenched in fists against his thighs. Sweat beaded along his hairline, but his gaze never left Patricia. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision that would define him. Collins' voice cut through the din, firm and measured. "This isn't an interpretation of bylaws. This is state law and corporate liability. If you authorize patrols with firearms, without proper contracts or coverage, the entire board assumes responsibility. Every lawsuit, every settlement, every loss will fall on each of you personally." The murmurs deepened into shouts. One board member slammed his palm against the table. "You told us the contracts were approved." Patricia's eyes flashed, her mask slipping. "They were. They are. This is all fabricated." That's when Mark rose to his feet. The scrape of his chair silenced the room faster than any gavel. His chest heaved, his face pale, but his voice carried with a clarity born of desperation. "No," he said, his words trembling but firm. "There are no contracts. I know because she told me to forge them." The room froze. Every head turned toward him. Patricia's face twisted in fury. "You're lying." Mark's body betrayed his torment, hands shaking, knees unsteady. But he didn't sit back down. He held his ground, shoulders squared, as though he'd finally found the strength to carry the weight he'd been avoiding. "I typed her drafts. I saw the threats in them. She told me to falsify signatures. I couldn't do it. And now it's gone too far." Gasps swept through the hall. The board erupted again, but this time it wasn't fear of Patricia. It was outrage directed at her. She opened her mouth to claw back control, but the tide had shifted. Collins didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "There's your corroboration. Not just intimidation, not just liability, fraud. You all have a decision to make. Continue following her, and you tie yourselves to criminal charges and financial ruin. Or you distance yourselves now, before it's too late." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match. Board members glanced at one another, faces pale, jaws clenched. The truth had landed, and Patricia's power, so long built on fear, was collapsing in front of them. Patricia's eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for allies. None met her gaze. Even those who had once parroted her every word now sat stone-faced, unwilling to be dragged down with her. She turned her fury on me. "You planned this. You and your badge, meddling where you don't belong." I stepped forward, calm and deliberate. "You pointed a gun at my mother. You escalated beyond authority. And now the consequences are yours, not theirs." The room held its breath. Patricia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the podium, but her voice came out strained, broken. "You can't do this to me. I built this community. I kept it together." "No," Collins said flatly, gathering the files into his briefcase. "You fractured it. Tonight, it begins to heal without you." The board members didn't cheer or clap. They didn't need to. Their silence, their refusal to stand with her, was louder than any outburst. Patricia had lost her crown, her control, her grip on Willow Creek, and tomorrow, when the official filings landed, she'd face more than humiliation. She'd face the law. The days after Patricia's collapse felt strange, like the neighborhood was holding its breath and learning how to exhale again. For so long, fear had seeped into every hedge, every driveway, every whispered conversation. Now, the silence that lingered wasn't fear. It was the cautious quiet of a community realizing its chains had been cut. The official filings came swiftly. Collins moved with precision, Randall's suspension notice hit the board, and Patricia found herself cornered from every angle. Criminal intimidation, fraud, liability exposure, each charge snapped into place like the bars of a cage she'd built for herself. When deputies arrived at her house, she didn't smirk. She didn't bark orders. She stood pale and rigid as they led her away, the weight of consequence pressing down harder than any neighbor ever could. Word spread fast. Neighbors who once darted, their eyes away when I passed, now stopped me at the park, at the mailbox, even outside the grocery store. They spoke in quiet gratitude, voices carrying the relief of people who'd been living under siege without calling it by name. Some admitted they'd been too scared to act. Others confessed they'd believed Patricia's threats until they saw her crumble in front of the board. Fear was gone, replaced by something that had been missing for years: trust. I didn't take credit. I couldn't. All I'd done was push Patricia into the light and let her arrogance do the rest. The real shift came from people like Mark, who finally found the courage to step out from the shadow and tell the truth. His confession had been the hammer blow that cracked Patricia's mask. Without him, her empire might have limped on longer, draining the community piece by piece. One evening, I walked the park again. The bulletin board still stood, but the rows of violation notices were gone. In their place, a handwritten note read, "Temporary HOA. Operations suspended pending reorganization." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Without Patricia's iron grip, the community had a chance to rebuild. I paused by the gazebo, watching children ride bikes without parents pulling them back in fear of disrupting order. Laughter rang freely, bouncing off the manicured lawns that finally felt like they belonged to the families who lived here. Willow Creek was still a gated community, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. Back home, I found my mother on the porch, rocking gently in the chair that started it all. The sunset painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, the kind of light my father used to sit under, carving wood while the day burned away. My mother's eyes glistened as she looked up at me, one hand resting on the smooth armrest. "He'd be proud," she said softly. I lowered myself into the chair beside her, the boards creaking under my weight. For a long time, we sat in silence, the rhythm of her rocking chair blending with the soft sounds of the evening. The fight was over, but the legacy remained. My father's promise, carved into wood, had survived, and I had kept my oath to protect it. Neighbors passed along the sidewalk, some waving, some stopping briefly to talk. They didn't look over their shoulders anymore. Patricia's reign of fear had ended, and the community was theirs again. For me, that was enough. I leaned back, the smell of jasmine drifting through the air, and let the weight of the past weeks fall away. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through patience, truth, and the steady hand of law. Patricia had tried to rule like a queen, but even queens answer to the law when their arrogance oversteps the bounds of humanity. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching. From